assistance. Shadow Secretary of State Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And once again, just like with the unemployment bill, we are gathering to witness another throwback to the 1970s, because despite what the Secretary of State says, ideology is clearly core to the legislation she's putting forward today. Otherwise, she wouldn't be ruling out concessionary schemes as on TfL or on Merseyrail. At this time, it is our railways which are about to become the latest victim of the government's desire not for government oversight, but for state control. So we go down the rabbit hole. There is nothing in this bill, despite the warm words of the Secretary of State, that guarantees growth in our rail network or cheaper fares. In fact, only this morning the Secretary of State refused to say that rail prices would continue to come down. Nothing to guarantee safer, more comfortable journeys on our railways. No plans for greater electrification. Hardly surprising, given that the last Conservative government delivered 20 times the amount of electrification in our 14 years as Labour achieved in their 13 years. And yet this government has chosen to again betray North Wales and abandon the Midlands main line upgrade as well. Both really important electrification projects. Nothing in this bill promises, nothing that promises better and more consistent internet connections on our trains. Instead, like card soldiers out of Alice in Wonderland, the Secretary of State is busy covering up her blunders by painting the roses red. She claims the new branding isn't just a paint job. Well, what on earth is it? Madam Deputy Speaker, we on these benches know the answer to that. She is trying to paint over the cracks of a rusting hulk of a bill that picks the pockets of every other single DfT budget, whether it comes to our roads or bus users, whether it comes to air passengers and air travel, whether it comes to active travel. All will be hit with cuts, and all will also be hit with higher taxes, so that she and her civil servants can play with trains in the Department of Transport. And I give way to the honourable member.
I'm grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. One of the first acts of this Labour government was to hose money at striking train drivers to buy them off. Does he share my concern that we will see the cost of a publicly run railway increase dramatically to the cost of taxpayers, and we will see services get worse?
I think the honourable gentleman makes a very important point, actually, and it was interesting to hear yes from the government benches, because that's exactly what they did do. They did throw money at the transport unions. And it's particularly interesting that the Transport Secretary said today that they'd be facing £2 billion a year subsidy for the foreseeable future. That's not what they've said in written question answers to me or to colleagues on this side of the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me be absolutely clear that when it comes to Britain's railways, we are not against the idea of United Track and Train. We back a model that brings coherence to the system, but not one that weakens scrutiny and clamps down on competition. That is why we've supported the concessionary model, which the Secretary of State will no doubt recall from her own time at Transport for London, along with honourable members from Merseyside and those from Greater Manchester, where the model is being proposed. I don't think anybody has ever considered those to be on the far right.
Earlier referred to ideology. Surely it was a Tory ideology that privatised the railways in the first place. An ideology that's not been copied anywhere else in the world, precisely because it costs the taxpayer more and it costs the passenger more.
I think we can all see the ideology at play today, because if there was some, if it was the case, as the honourable member states, I think his constituencies in Greater Manchester, where actually the mayor's calling for a concessionary model, a partnership between actually the state and the private sectors, something directly opposed in the bill that he's going to be supporting this evening. So the honourable gentleman is quite far off the mark. The number of passengers on our railways doubled in the 25 years after services were returned to the private sector, after half a century of decline. And we support the vital role of open access operators, always giving passengers brand new routes to cheap, affordable fares, often with direct services to London. Direct services that honourable member for Rochdale actually called for recently, but will no longer be be available, I don't think, under the new system, such as a direct line for Cleethorpes to London that my honourable friend, the member for Briggate and Immingham, has long campaigned for and I visited a week ago. We back a joined-up approach that places passengers and taxpayers at the heart of our railway. We recognise that fragmentation held our railway back and have long championed partnership with private sector involved, driving innovation and growth. That's why we did the Shapps-Williams review. Yeah. What the Secretary of State has brought forward is not a coherent model at all. It is something altogether different and something that ought to trouble members right across the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, her bill ignores the evidence, the experts, the fervent cries of freight. The growth has to be at the forefront of any rail reform. Instead, in keeping with the worst traditions of the 1970s, her bill has a return to state control throughout it, not a growth in passenger numbers that would reduce taxpayer subsidy. Otherwise, why is it not on the front of the bill? Not growth in competition that would bring down prices for passengers, not growth of freight, more lorries off our roads, and growth of new routes to serve the length and breadth of the country. Nowhere on the face of her bill is there actually a target for passenger growth. It's a bill that actively works against open access, which, if the Secretary of State gets her way, will be left wholly and deliberately vulnerable. I give the word to the Honourable Lady.
The Shadow Minister for giving way. And one area that we can all agree that we want to see in passenger growth is those with disabilities and those that find steps incredibly difficult. So I wonder whether the Shadow Minister could answer. On the 24th of May 2024, the previous government announced 50 stations would benefit from step-free access, including my local station at Leagrave. But the funding never existed. How is it that the Shadow Minister can criticise our plans when he made promises of these funds that never existed?
Well, I think the last government actually did a huge amount to improve access to stations right across the country, and obviously I'd like to see more of that happen right across the country. And I'll give way to my honourable friend, I think, on a similar point.
To the Shadow Secretary, it's giving way, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, whether it was the last government or this government, and by the way, the current government being in power, 18 months, so I think all of that is wearing a bit thin. For passengers, in particular disabled passengers, they just want a railway that works to agree with the Secretary of State. So on step-free access, does my right honourable friend agree that more needs to be done, but there is very little at the moment in this bill that would suggest that more is going to be done, particularly in rural stations such as Cosford or Shifnal or Brighton in Shropshire. And if it can't be done in every station, and there is no money to do it in every station, there at least needs to be step-free access and improved disability access somewhere along inter-county railway lines.
I totally agree with my right honourable friend on that issue, and I'd also say that I think the point he made earlier in the debate was also an important one, that people want to see through train runnings, because there is nothing which benefits disabled passengers more than the through train services, such as from his constituency, which would potentially be available with open access. Now, that is something which I believe that the Department of Transport, on the service that he mentioned earlier on, opposed. Now, the Transport Secretary can correct me if she wishes, but I think it's come to something when this government is actively working against new routes across the country. It's a bill that actively works against open access, which, if the Secretary of State gets her way, will be left wholly and, I suspect, deliberately vulnerable. GBR is mimicking some statist salami-style tactic that will cut by slice until open access is dead. But above all, this is a bill that does not put passengers or taxpayers first. A passenger council, which is a far cry from what the Right Honourable Lady for Sheffield Healy ever envisaged, watered down beyond recognition. What remains is no watchdog at all, a dog with no teeth, no enforcement powers, a dog that can barely bite. Even in the government's own fact sheet, this so-called watchdog is confined to advising and reporting. GBR must listen, but nowhere does it have to comply. This is not accountability, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is blatant window dressing behind triple glazing. For if it's not to be toothless, then there would have to be standards. Standards that GBR would be expected to adhere to. So I ask the Right Honourable Lady, where are the rigorous performance standards, the KPIs for the network, that parliamentary question after parliamentary question she and her ministers have promised will be released? She has taken operators into state control, but refuses to set out by which standards they should be judged. Does she have no standards, or perhaps it's because she would rather let performance slip and then claim credit for any tiny improvement she can spin down the line? Instead, we must contend with insufficient protections for things like ticket retailers, so passengers who use apps like Trainline, incredibly popular, TrainPal or Uber, will no doubt have to pay more for a shoddier service as the government pushes these growing businesses to the brink as it is today. From out of these depths, one inescapable conclusion emerges. The only people who will benefit from this bill aren't passengers, nor are they taxpayers, but her union paymasters who stand to cash in with no commitments to modernisation, no commitments to increase efficiency, no commitments to abolish outdated working practices. Every possible incentive for increasing efficiency has been ignored or abandoned on the altar of ideology. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you for giving way. He talks about modernisation. He talks about his concerns about the government's approach. In 2017, SWR spent £1 billion on new trains to serve my constituents on the Reading to Waterloo train line. Those trains sat in sidings, and it wasn't until SWR were brought back into public ownership that we have seen the quadrupling of those arterial trains now rolling out. That is the real demonstrable benefit of this government's approach. Does he not agree that the model he proposes that we go back to failed, and there is no clearer sign of that failing than those trains sitting in sidings?
The honourable gentleman, along with clearly some of his colleagues, haven't been listening to what I've been saying, because actually we put forward the Shapps-Williams review in order to deliver a new concessionary model. But and that's exactly some of that funding that he talks about was delivered through modernisation. It was delivered under the last government. Let's be clear about it. What's actually happening on SWR for his constituents under this government they are seeing greater delays right across the network, and they're seeing it month after month after month, despite the promises of the Secretary of State. Anyway, with such a flagrant disregard for taxpayers' money and an ain't-bothered approach to passenger welfare, I had hoped that the Secretary of State would have ensured that this bill contained the necessary safeguards, guardrails perhaps, a strong regulator with a statutory authority to intervene and set things straight. Are we going to have such a regulator? Oh, but we dare to dream. If the honourable member wishes to intervene, why does he stand up? Today, operators propose Today, operators propose, and the Office of Road and Rail decides. But under this bill, GBR will propose, and GBR will decide. We find ourselves in the most bizarre position of all. The Office of Road and Rail handing over its powers on deciding track access, deciding access charges to GBR, the very entity that has the most to gain by acting in its own self-interest. And that self-interest in this bill is allowed to be unfettered and unperturbed by any genuine oversight. So who, can I ask, the Secretary of State, will be in charge of the railways in this new thrilling world of state control? Because according to the responses I've received to parliamentary questions, we're still not clear. Rail fares apparently will be decided by ministers at the Department of Transport. Automation of train technology will be, according to the WPQs I've received, the government's collective responsibility. Working arrangements with unions will be managed by individual local train operators, and the guiding mind of it all will be GBR. This is not, as the Secretary of State and her ministers have claimed, how any organisation ought to be run. It is an organisational mishmash, rudderless, directionless, and it will not serve passengers. It won't serve freight, and it certainly won't serve taxpayers. Certainty, supposedly guaranteed to freight, industry and manufacturing, is entirely absent. In its place, we have the misfortune of a funding mechanisms that can be changed and amended at any time without any oversight whatsoever. We have a duty to freight, which, although is clearly an afterthought, it is obviously welcome. But once a reality kicks in, the GBR's overlordship of the process and of access, pricing and timetabling will leave freight operators permanently in the lurch. We have conflict of interest after conflict of interest permeating this bill, with about as much credibility as her promise a couple of weeks ago that this government had no plans to introduce paper mile on our roads. I wonder if the Right Honourable Lady has corrected Hansard yet. We desperately need an indication of purpose. What is it for? Who is it all for? Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's pretty clear that we want to see passengers put first, with a reliable, safe and accessible journeys that provide value for money. Open access routes protected, including those serving Hull, championed by the members for Hull East and Hull West and Halton Price, and those serving Doncaster, with the members for Doncaster North, Doncaster Central, Doncaster East and the Isle of Axholme, know their constituents really depend on. Oversight must be accompanied by actual enforcement, and passengers and taxpayers must be at the forefront of the bill, which they are currently not. I will happily give way.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way, and he's talking about passengers being at the heart of this. And he raised earlier the issues of watchdogs and dogs not having teeth. As a veterinary surgeon, I'm very conscious of a subset of dogs that we need to think about in this in terms of passenger access. Does he agree with me that people need to work together to actually make sure that people with assistance dogs and guide dogs have good access onto this railway? So in terms of modernisation and access, we need to keep these people in our mind.
They're trying to shut him down.
I totally agree with my honourable friend, and it's quite clear that when it comes to modernisation and access and new trains, that's exactly what we want to see delivered, and there's no mention of it in this legislation. This is why we've tabled our reasonable amendment today, because a bill with no independent regulator, no protection for competition, nor for taxpayers' money, nor a passenger growth duty, and no credible enforcement cannot command the support of this side of the House. For the Secretary of State, throughout this murky and blinkered process, she has shown that she does not have the will to make sensible changes. Like the Prime Minister and Chancellor, the Right Honourable Member for Leicester West, she hasn't got the guts to face down her backbenchers who call for greater state control right across the system. She won't strengthen the bill, she won't restore independence, she won't protect open access, embed growth or put passengers first. Instead, she presses on, convinced that centralising power will somehow solve the very problems centralisation always creates. But let there be no shadow of a doubt, when, as it is inevitable, things go wrong, leaving passengers without recourse or redress, she and she alone will face the consequences. She will own the cancellations, the overcrowding, the endless complaints about no internet signal, the strikes, the rising taxpayer subsidy, and the fateful day when passengers learn she can no longer afford to use taxpayers' money to prop up her much-vaunted fares. Madam Deputy Speaker, we on these benches will fight to deliver a railway that works for passengers, for taxpayers, for freight and for the future. And we will not sit idly by and allow this government to turn GBR into judge, jury and executioner on the network it alone controls. And I hope the members from other benches will support our calls here and in another place over the coming weeks and months.